Chapter 11. Azirarezo, Orsi repeated. I know the name. One of the drawbacks to sending your enemy ahead by way of a gesture is that you're left with the rest of the body. Orsi had insisted on seeing it. Miel wasn't sure why. He believed it was because Orsi had always had a tendency to be squeamish. Since he'd ordered the wretched woman's execution, he felt he should punish himself by viewing her decapitated trunk. If that was the reason, it was confused, irrational, hard for anyone else to understand, and quite in character. You've met her, Miel said, several times. You'd remember her if... He stopped. Orsi grinned. He was white as milk and shaking a bit. Of course, he said. That's me all over. Not so good with names, but an excellent memory for faces. In this case, however, Miel frowned. Can we go now? He said. Yes, why not? Orsi turned away abruptly. He'd seen worse, to Miel's certain knowledge, but the fact that he was directly responsible, having given the order, presumably made it more immediate. Of course, Orsi would argue that he'd also given the order to attack Mezentia. I've never had anybody put to death before, he said, all false casual. What's the procedure? Can it just be buried quietly somewhere, or does it have to be nailed to a door or strung up off a gateway somewhere? Miel nearly said, well, that's up to you, but stopped himself just in time. I'd leave it to the guard commander if I were you, he said. There's no set protocol, if that's what you mean. They walked through the arch into the main courtyard of the guardhouse. So, Orsi said, I met her a couple of times. When and where? She used to call it the palace, Miel said, carefully looking ahead. Call, Orsi repeated, as though it was an abstruse foreign loanword. What, on business, you mean? That's right, Miel said. She mostly dealt in luxury stationery. Ivory writing sets, antique Mezzantine ink bottles, signet rings, that kind of stuff. Come to think of it, I bought a silver sandshaker from her myself last spring. She did a lot of business with the court, then? Like I said, luxury goods, not the sort of thing most people can afford. Yes, Orsi said, as though Miel was being obtuse, but what I mean is she knew people here in the palace, and she was spying for the Republic. Aren't you worried about that? Only Orsi could ask such a question. Of course I'm worried, Miel said. Just not surprised like you, he didn't add. Obviously there's a serious problem. Glad you can see that, Orsi snapped. What are you proposing to do about it? Miel stopped, frowning. Thank you, he said. What are you thanking me for? The promotion. Apparently I'm head of security now, or captain of the palace guard or something. I'm honored, but you might have told me earlier. I'm sorry. And he was, too, sincerely sorry for being nasty to his friend. That was why Miel loved him, and why he was such a bad duke. It's because I've come to rely on you so much since the battle. I got wounded, and you had to get us all out of that ghastly mess, and since then I've turned to you first for everything. Loaded it all on your shoulders without even asking if you minded, and now I automatically assume you're dealing with it all like a one-man cabinet. He sighed. Miel felt embarrassed. You should be doing this job, not me, Miel. I just can't manage it. Miel forced a laugh. Only if you want a civil war on your hands, he said. A duchess on the throne, think about it. Half the people in this country would rather see Duke Valens get the crown than me. Orsi turned his head slightly, looked him in the eye. You wouldn't have invaded Mezentia, though. You don't know that, Miel shrugged. This isn't getting us anywhere. In answer to your question... What question? Oh yes, slipped my mind. What we do about the spy, Miel said. They started walking again. Well, he said, you don't need to be a doctor of logic to figure out that the likeliest place to find spies is in the merchant adventurers. They go everywhere. No people here and abroad. They haven't got the same loyalties as us. Nobody else has the opportunities or the motive like they have. Orsi frowned. So what are you saying? He said. Round them all up and have them killed? Miel clicked his tongue. No, of course not, he said. But we're looking at this the wrong way, asking ourselves the wrong questions. Such as? Such as why, Miel said. Think about it for a moment. Why is Mezentia spying on us after they've just beaten us so hard we wouldn't be a threat to them again for another 100 years? Before now, that'd make sense. But after? Orsi was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said. Nor me, Miel said. I mean, there could be several reasons. Well, such as? Well, Miel ordered his thoughts. It could be that this Razo woman had been spying for them for years. And we only just found out. Like, she was a fixture permanently stationed here as part of a standing intelligence network. You think that's what she was doing? It's a possibility. There are others. For instance, they could have been alarmed because they didn't have as much advance notice of the invasion as they'd liked. Didn't seem to trouble them much. Yes, but they're a nation of perfectionists, Meal said, slightly warily, so they decided to set up a long-term spy ring here to give them more warning next time. Orsi looked worried. So that's what you reckon? Meal succeeded in keeping the irritation out of his face. No point in setting up a string of straw men if Orsi took them all seriously. Another possibility, he said, is that they're planning to invade us. This time Orsi just looked bewildered. Why would they want to do that? He said. Meal shrugged. To save face, he said. To punish us for daring to attack them? To make sure we never pose a threat again? There are all sorts of possible reasons. Most likely it'll be the internal politics inside the Republic. Do they have politics? Orsi interrupted. I thought they were above all that sort of thing. Meal actually did laugh. Do they have politics? He said. Yes, they do. Quite apart from ordinary backstabbing and dead men's shoes filling and infighting for who gets the top jobs, they have a number of factions, started as ideological differences over doctrine. Nowadays it's just force of habit, an excuse for taking sides. It's not politics about anything anymore, just politics. Oh, Orsi looked mildly shocked. Is that good or bad? For us? Meal made a vague gesture with his hands. Well, it depends on the circumstances. Bad for us if someone wants a quick, easy war to gain popular support. Good for us if the opposing faction outplays them. It'd be really nice if we could find a way of influencing them, playing off one faction against each other, but we can't. Why not? Well, we haven't got anything any of them could conceivably want. Mill replied. Except, he added, if the didactics or the consolidationists want a war for the approval ratings, we're a handy target. Orsi pulled a face. Bad then. Probably. You know all this stuff. There was bitterness in Orsi's voice, and guilt, and other things too complex to bother with. I feel so stupid. I'm an advisor, Meal said, trying not to sound awkward. It's an advisor's job to know stuff so you don't have to. Orsi laughed. Yeah, but look at me, clueless. What did I ever do to deserve to be a duke except marry someone's daughter? Meal frowned ever so slightly. Orsi, this isn't helping. You want to know the implications of this Razo woman being a spy. I'm sorry, Orsi said. Go on, you were saying. That's right. Meal pulled a face. Forgotten where I'd got to. Right. We know she was spying for the Republic because she admitted it. We can guess why, but that's about all. To go back to your original question, what are we going to do about it? Yes? Meal rubbed his eyes. He'd been up all night and he felt suddenly tired. I don't know what to suggest right now, he said. That was all we managed to get out of her, that she was spying for the Mezzantines. We tried to get names of other spies, contacts, the usual stuff, but she died on us. Weak heart, apparently. Orsi nodded. So really, he said, we need to find out some more background before we can make any decisions. I think so. I mean, we've sent a pretty clear message to the Republic that we know what they were up to, and there won't be any more reports from that particular source, so that's probably the immediate problem taken care of. Next priority, I would suggest, is finding out who else was in the spy ring, and making our peace with the merchant adventurers. After all, it depends on what we come up with. Orsi was satisfied with that, and they parted at the lodge gate. Meal went away with mixed feelings. A large part of them guilt, for having misled his friend. It wasn't a significant act of deception. All he'd done was steer the conversation away from one particular topic, and the amount of effort he'd had to put into it, given Orsi's naivete, was practically nil. Still, he felt uneasy, guilty. It must be catching, he thought. He went back to the turret room in the west court that he'd appropriated for an office. Me, he thought, needing an office. If Cousin Jarnak ever finds out I've got an office, he'll wet himself laughing. He shut the door and bolted it, then pulled out a key on a chain from under his shirt. The key opened a strong oak chest, bound with heavy iron straps and hasps. All it contained was one very small piece of paper, folded many times to make it small. He unfolded it for the 10th or 11th time since it had come into his possession. As he did so, he read the words, tiny but superbly elegant, on the outside fold. Valens Valentinianus to Beatrice Siropati. Greetings. Shouldn't we wait, Ziani had said, until your husband gets here? There's another break there. The woman in the red dress looked at him. You'll be waiting a long time, she said. I'm not married. Ziani could feel the brick fall. I'm sorry, he said. Only it's different where I come from. Oh, yes, there was a grim ring to her voice. But you're not in the Republic anymore. I'm beginning to see that, Ziani said. Look, I didn't mean anything by it. Can we forget? Sure, the woman replied, her tone making it clear that she had no intention of doing so. So, you're the new great white hope, well, you know what I mean, of Iremian trade. Everybody's talking about you. Are they? Ziani said. Well, there's not much to see yet, but I can take you around and give you an idea of what we're going to be doing here once we're up and running. She looked at him again. She seemed to find him fascinating. He wondered, has she ever seen a mezzanine before? He'd have expected her to, being a merchant and an adventurer, but it was possible she hadn't, not that it mattered. Fine, she said. I'll try and use my imagination. Right, Ziani said. He put her out of his mind. Not easy to ignore something quite so large and so very red. It was like failing to notice a battle in your wardrobe, and engaged the plan. It had grown inside his head to the point where he could see it quite clearly with his eyes open, superimposed over the dusty, weed-grown yard like a cutter's template. Well, where we're stood now, this is where the foundry is going to be. I see. The plan is to do all our own casting, Ziani went on. Mostly it'll just be small components. But I'm going to build a fair-sized drop-bottom cupola so we can pour substantial lost cast waxings, as well as the usual sandbox stuff. It sounds like a big undertaking, but really it's just 4 walls, a hearth, ventilation, and a clay-lined pit. Next to it, so we can share some of the pipe work, I want to have the puddling mill. Excuse me? Ziani smiled. For smelting direct from ore, he said. Back home, we can get sufficient heat to melt iron into a pourable liquid, but it'll be a while before I'm ready to do that here. Until then, we'll have to do it the old-fashioned, labor-intensive way. The best we'll be able to do is get the iron out of the ore and into a soft, malleable lump. That's called puddling. Then it's going to be bashed on with big hammers to draw it out into the sections we want. Sheet, plate, square bar, round bar, and so on. Quite high on the list of priorities is a big trip hammer, so we won't actually have to do the bashing by hand, but we can't do that until we've got the water to drive it. 3 months, maybe, assuming everything runs to schedule. Water? The woman said. That's right, like a water mill for grinding flour. The first big mechanical project will need to be a pump, wind-driven, God help us, to get water up into a tower to a sufficient height. Once we've done that, life will be a lot easier. She stared at him for a moment, then shrugged. Right, she said. Go on. Over here, Ziani continued, I want the main machine shop. It makes sense to have the shop right next to the foundry and the smelting area. It saves on time and labor hauling big heavy chunks of material about the place. So basically we'll have a big open square area for fabrication and assembly. The machine shop on the north side, foundry and smelter on the south side, main forge on the east. I thought, because we don't need the light there so much. He knew it was all passing her by, soaring over her head like the white-fronted geese in spring. He was a little surprised by that. A trader ought to be able to understand technical matters, well enough to at least grasp the implications. That this was an enterprise on an unprecedented scale never seen outside the Republic, an astounding opportunity, therefore, for anyone with an instinct for business. She didn't seem to have picked up on that. She was bored. She looked as if she was being introduced to his large, tiresome family, none of whom she'd ever meet again. Not if she could help it. Annoying, he thought. Can she really be the person in charge, or had they just sent down a junior? But he didn't mind giving her the tour of his hidden realm. Wasn't there a fairy tale about a magical land that only the pure in heart could see? Saying it out loud helped him make it ever more solid in his own mind. Gave him another chance to pick up any flaws or omissions that had slipped past him. He was, as usual, talking to himself for the benefit of an eavesdropper. And that, he concluded, is all there is to it, more or less. So what do you think? She was silent, frowning. Then she said, Fine. Just one thing. What's that? You haven't actually said what you're planning on making here. But, stupid woman, hadn't she been listening? No, he realized she hadn't. He'd assumed she'd be able to work that out for herself. Apparently not. Pretty much anything, really, he said. If it's made of metal, of course. Anything from a siege catapult to an earring back. Really? The look in her eyes said, You still haven't answered my question. Furthermore, Ziani went on, and this is the real point of it, we can make machines that'll make anything at all. Pottery, cloth, furniture, glass, you name it. What's more, it'll be made to mezzanine standards, faster and cheaper than anywhere else in the world, and every single item will be exactly the same as all the others. Can you begin to understand what that'll mean? He had an idea that she was struggling to keep her temper. That's fine, she said. I'm impressed, I truly am, but you haven't told me what you're planning to make. I need something I can load in the back of a cart and sell, and all you've shown me is a derelict yard with thistles growing in it. Ziani took a deep breath. You don't quite understand, he said. Here's the idea. You tell me what you want, what you think you can sell 1,000 of at a good profit, anything you like. Then you go away and come back a bit later, and there it'll be, anything you like. The look she was giving him now was quite different. She'd stopped thinking he was boring. Now she thought he was mad. If only, he thought, I had something I could actually show her, some little piece of mezzanine magic, like a lathe or a drill, so she could see for herself. But it didn't work like that. She was saying something. He pulled himself together and paid attention. When you were back in Mezzentia, she said, that place where you used to work, what did you make there? Ziani grinned. Weapons, he said. She looked at him. The final straw, obviously. Like those machines they killed our army with? He nodded. The Scorpion, he said. Lightweight, mobile field artillery. We built 1,200 units while I was at the ordnance factory. They used to leave the production line at the rate of a dozen a day. He couldn't read the expression on her face, which was unusual. Quite a straightforward item in engineering terms, he went on, just filling time. Tempering the spring was the only tricky bit, and we figured out a quick, easy way of doing that. Machining the winding mechanism. Why don't you make them? She asked. And he thought she was probably thinking out loud. Orsi'd buy them from you, no doubt about that. Ziani shrugged. If you could afford them, he said. It's a question of setting up. It'll take a long time before the first one was finished. In the meantime, there'd be workers and material to pay for. I was thinking of something nice and simple to begin with. Spoons, maybe, or dung forks. We'd have to start off doing a lot of the operations by hand till we made enough money to pay for building the more advanced machines. She shook her head. Orsi doesn't want spoons, she said, and nobody else in this country's got any money. Not the sort of money you're thinking of. These are poor people by your standards. I know, Ziani said. That's... He stopped. She wasn't invited into that part of the plan. It wasn't in a fit state to receive visitors yet. What would you suggest? He said. Make weapons, she told him without hesitation. Orsi would buy them. He'd give you the money if you could show him a finished, what's the word? Prototype? That's it. If you had one he could see, he'd feel he had to buy them to make up for losing the war and putting us all in danger. She hesitated, then went on. We'd put up the money to make the first one in return for a share of the profits. You're forgetting, Ziani said. I offered to work for him and he turned me down. She shook her head. I know all about that, she said. You just went at it from the wrong angle, head-on, bull at a gate. You've got to be more like twiddling a bit of string under a cat's nose. You get Orsi up here and show him one of these Scorpion machines, tell him this is what wiped out your army, how many of them do you want, he wouldn't be able to refuse. She frowned thoughtfully. Then you could give him your speech, the one you gave me. Furnaces and trip hammers and puddling, whatever. He wouldn't be listening, of course. He'd be looking at the war machine, and then he'd say yes. Ziani nodded slowly. And you, your merchant adventurers, would put up the money. Yes, within reason, she added quickly, for just one. You can make just one, without all the machinery and everything? I could, Ziani said, hand-forging and filing. It'd be a bit of a budge-up. But I don't suppose your Duke Orsi would know what he was looking at. So long as it worked, she replied. She took a deep breath. So, she went on. Roughly how much are we talking about? She couldn't hear it, of course, the soft click of the component dropping into place. Ziani kept the smile off his face and answered her question. As he'd expected, she looked rather unwell for a moment. Then she said, All right. After that, they talked about timescales and materials and money for a while. Then she went away. She was looking tired, Ziani reckoned, as though she was carrying a heavy weight. He went back to the tower after she'd gone. There was something about it that appealed to him. The view, perhaps, or the confined nature of the space, maybe just the fact that it was a comfortable temperature in the fierce midday heat. In an hour or so, when it was cool enough for work, the builders would be arriving to start work on the footings for the foundry house. Something tangible, even if it was only a hole in the flagstones, a pile of sand, a stack of bricks, something he could see with his eyes rather than just his mind, to confirm that the design was starting to take shape. There was still a long way to go. The factory, the Duke's involvement, making scorpions, all of the individual components that were also intricate mechanisms in themselves. If only, he couldn't help thinking, all this inventiveness and ingenuity could be spent on something truly worthwhile, such as a modified dividing head for the vertical mills at the ordnance factory in Mezzentia. If only his talent could be used for something other than abomination. He'd heard a story once, about the old days, the very early days of the guilds, before the specifications were drawn up and the world was made fixed. Once, according to the story, there lived in the city a great engineer who worked in the first of the new-style factories as a toolmaker. One day there was a terrible accident with one of the machines, and he lost both his hands. It happened that he was much afflicted by an itch in the middle of his back, something he'd lived with for years. Without hands he couldn't scratch, so he summoned his two ablest assistants and with their help designed and built a machine operated by his feet which would scratch his back for him. It was frighteningly complicated, and in the process of getting it to work, he thought up and perfected a number of mechanical innovations. The universal joint, according to some versions of the story, or the ratchet and escapement. When it was finished, all the cleverest designers in the guild came to look at it. They were filled with admiration and praised him for his skill and cunning. Yes, he replied sadly, that's all very well, but I'd much rather use my hand like I did before. All that invention and application to make a machine to do a task a small child could do without thinking. There was undoubtedly a lesson there. All stories from the old days had morals. It was practically a legal requirement. But he'd never been sure, till quite recently, what it was. Now, of course, he knew, but that wasn't really much comfort to him. When the men eventually showed up, the Aremian nation had many virtues, of which punctuality wasn't one. He went down to show them what to do and where to do it, then escaped back to his tower, the shade and the coolness of the massive stone blocks it was built from. He should have been down below. He had work to do, a machine to build. He ought by rights to be alive again, not a ghost haunting himself. But there were issues to be resolved before he could apply an uncluttered mind to the serious business of cutting and bending steel. He summoned a general parliament of his thoughts, and put the motion to be debated. It could be argued, he opened for his mind's prosecution, that he'd come a long way, away from the ordnance factory, the city, his home. Now he was in a place that was in many respects unsatisfactory, but which he could survive in, more or less. It might be hard to live here, but he could work, which was what really mattered. So long as he could work, he could exist. In a tenuous sort of a way, but the only one that mattered. He could be happy. A proverb says that the beating of the heart and the action of the lungs are useful prevarication, keeping all options open. He'd lost everything he'd ever had, but he was still on his feet, able to move, able to scribe a line and hold a file. The world hadn't ended. The day they came for him, compliance with their writ and their investigating officer and the armed men from the guild hall. Now he was here, and there wasn't any real need, was there, to build and set in motion the enormous machine that so far existed only in his mind. He was here. He could stay here, settle down, start a business. A lot of people did that, lesser men than himself. So could he. But, replied the defense, he could only do this if he was still at heart the man he'd been the day before they came for him. If leaving there and coming here had changed him, damaged him, that's what he was getting at, surely, then the absolute priority must be to put the damage right, and only the machine could do that. Query, the prosecution rejoined, the motivation behind the machine. Consider the man in the story. Did he build his machine just to scratch his back, or because he was an engineer, because he could? Consider himself. Was the purpose of the machine as simple, small, and pure as he wanted the court to believe? Or was it something darker and vaguer? An inevitable result of engaging the machine would be the end of the world. He had admitted and regretted it as an unavoidable piece of collateral damage. But what if it was really his principal motive? What if he was building the machine out of a desire to punish them? Or, punishment sublimated, to destroy an evil? What if the real reason for the machine was just revenge? What nonsense, the defense replied. He could only desire revenge against the Republic if he hated it, and he didn't. Nor did he want to change it except in one very small way. He had no quarrel with the guilds, or specification, or anything big and important. The Constitution, operating procedures, and internal structures were as near perfect as they could be, given that the Republic was built from fallible human flesh rather than reliable materials like stone and steel. One small adjustment was all he was after, a little thing, a trifle, something a fourth-level clerk in the central office could grant with a pen stroke. It was only because he was out here, outside, unable to follow the ordained procedure that he needed to resort to the machine. Since his exclusion wasn't his fault, the damage the machine would do couldn't be his fault either. It was a shame that it had to be done this way. But that one little adjustment wasn't negotiable. He had to have it, and if that meant the end of the world, that wasn't his problem. I have changed, he recognized. Something has happened to me. I never used to be like this. On the other hand, I was never in this situation before. Maybe I've simply grown to fit, rather than changed. Nevertheless, the machine, the overthrow of nations, the deaths of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, just so I can scratch my itching back, I have to ask myself whether it's justified. He thought about it and the little thing he wanted to achieve, and he realized that the debate was irrelevant. He had no choice as far as that little thing was concerned. He could no more turn his back on it than a stone dropped from a tower could refrain from falling. Most men desiring this thing wouldn't build the machine, but only because they wouldn't know how to. He knew, so he had to build it. He couldn't pretend it was beyond him because he knew it wasn't. The little thing, the most powerful destructive force in the world, the cause of all true suffering, the one thing everybody wants most of all, was pulling on him like the force that pulls the falling stone. and there was nothing he could do to resist it. Debate adjourned. He stood up. His back was slightly stiff from leaning against the wall as he squatted on the tower floor. He narrowed the focus of his mind, crowding out the bigger picture until all he could see was the frame, cycle parts, and mechanism of a scorpion. First, he said to himself, I'll need 32 feet of half-inch square section steel bar. Valens Valentinianus to Beatrice Sirapati greetings. I have read your letter. I know what you want. You want me to tell you how sympathetic I feel, how I know how difficult it must be for you, how brave you're being, how awful it is, you poor thing. I'd really like to be able to oblige, but that's not how my mind works, unfortunately. I read your letter, and at once I start thinking about ways and means. Things you could do, things I could do, things to be taken account of in deciding what's the best thing to be done. Only a few lines in and I already have a mind full of things. Which is the difference between you and me. You live in a world of people, and I live in a world of things. To you what matters is thoughts, feelings, love and hurt and pain and distress, with joy squeezing in wherever it can in little cracks like light, in small observations which you are kind enough to share with me. I, on the other hand, was brought up by my vicious bastard of a father to play chess with my life. A piece, a thing, manipulated here and there to bring about a desired result, an action taken, a move made, and I get what I want. The wolf driven into the net, the boar enfiladed by archers in covert, the enemy driven off with heavy losses, the famine averted, the nation saved. When I was a boy, when all men were boys, they lived from one toy to the next. Their lives were charted out by a relay of things longed for. A new bow, a new horse, a new doublet, a new girl, an education, enlightenment, a crown, laid out alongside the desert road, like way stations to get you home at last wherever it is you're supposed to be going. I've always lived for things. Some of them I can touch, some of them are abstracts. Glory, honor, justice, prosperity, peace. All of them are beads on a wire, with which to tally the score. I have, of course, never married, and it's a very long time now since I was last in love. Accordingly, I've never brutalized myself by turning love into another thing to be acquired. I've brutalized myself in lots of other ways, mind you, but not that one. So there's a sort of virginal innocence about me when I read your letter and instantly start translating your feelings into my list of things to be done the way bankers convert one currency into another. Put it another way. Having read your letter, I'm bursting like a cracked dam with suggestions about how to make things better. But because I am more than the sum of my upbringing and environment, I am managing just about not to. Congratulate me. You poor thing. It sounds absolutely awful. I feel for you. The trouble is, when I write that, I mean it. Buggered if I know how to say it so it sounds sincere. When I was a boy, I learned hunting, fencing, and how to rule a small country. Self-expression was optional, and I took self-pity instead. It was more boring, but I liked the teacher better. Poor Orsi. I wish he and I weren't enemies. In fact, I have an idea that we'd have got on well together if we'd met many years ago and all the things had been different. He and I are very different, opposites in most respects. I think I would have liked him. I believe he can see beyond things to people. It's a blessing to him and a curse. If he plays chess and sacrifices a knight to gain a winning advantage, I expect he can hear the knight scream as it dies. There are many wonderful uses in this world for a man like him. It's a pity he was forced into the wrong one. We took out the new limers today. We found in the long cover, ran the boar out into the downs, finally killed it in a little spinney, where he turned at bay. I ran in as soon as he stopped running and turned his head. I was so concerned about the dogs not getting hurt, because I've only just got them. They're my newest things, see? That I went at the boar front on, just me, staring into his eyes with nothing between us except 8-foot pole of ash with a spike on one end. As he charged, he hated me. Because he hated me, he charged. Because he charged, he lost. I'm not strong enough to drive a spear blade through all that hide, muscle, and bone, but he is. His hate was his undoing, so it served him right. The hunter never hates his quarry. It's a thing which he wants to get, to reduce into possession, so how could he hate it? The boar only hated me because he recognized he'd been manipulated into an impossible situation where he couldn't win or survive. I can understand that. I made him hate me. But hate is unforgivable, so it served him right. It was my fault that he was brought to bay, but he was responsible for his own undoing. I think. It's hard to be sure. I think it's the gray areas that I find most satisfying. Melitus, too, used the hunt as an allegory for human passions and feelings. Strictly speaking, he was more of a neo-mannerist than a romantic, I feel. But that's largely a subjective judgment. Poor Orsi. I feel for him, too. If there's anything you'd like me to do, just say. That made the 10th time he'd read it, and it still said the same. Miel folded the letter up again and put it back in the chest. He turned the key, took it out, put it away. There. Now, nobody but he knew where it was, or even that it existed. But he could feel it through an inch of oak, as though it was watching him and grinning. A sensible man would burn it, he told himself. Get rid of it, pretend he'd never seen it, wipe it out of his life, and hope it'd go away forever. That was what a sensible man would do. He went down the stairs and walked briskly to the long solar where Orsi would be waiting for him. His clothes felt clammy against his skin, and his hands itched where he touched the parchment. Miel. Orsi was sitting in the big chair with broad flat arms. He had his feet up on a table and he was reading a book. Sorry I'm late. You aren't. Orsi put the book face down on his knee. Against an unarmored opponent, the common pitchfork is a more effective weapon than a conventional spear. Discuss. Miel raised both eyebrows. Good heavens, he said. Let me think. Well, you've got the advantage of that bit in the middle, I suppose, where the two arms of the fork join. You can use it for blocking against a sword or an axe, or binding and jamming a spear or a halberd. Or you could use it to trap the other man by the neck without injuring him. He paused. Orsi was still looking at him. You can't over-penetrate because the fork stops you from going too far in so you can disengage quicker. How am I doing? Orsi nodded. This man here, he said, waggling the book, reckons the pitchfork is the ideal weapon for a hastily levied troop in time of emergency. Actually, he's full of bright ideas. For instance, there's the triple-armed man. A man with 3 arms? No, Orsi shook his head. It's like this. You've got your bow and arrow, right? Strapped to your left wrist, which is extended, holding the bow. Which you've got your pike. Finally, you've got your sword at your side if all else fails. Or there's a really good one here. You've got your heavy siege catapults drawn up behind your infantry line, and instead of rocks, you load them with poisonous snakes. As soon as the enemies charge, you let go, and down come the snakes like a heavy shower. Miel frowned. Who is this clown? Orsi lifted the book so Miel could see the spine. His name, Orsi said, isn't actually recorded. It just says, A Treatise on National Defense by a Patriot. He held the book out at arm's length and let it fall to the floor. The snake idea is particularly silly, he said. I can see it now. You spend a year poking round under rocks to find all these snakes. You pack them up in jars or wicker baskets or whatever you keep snakes in. You've got a special snake warden, hired at fabulous expense, and a separate wagon train to carry them, plus all their food and fresh water and God knows what else. Somehow or other, you get them to the battle along with 24 huge great catapults, which you've somehow contrived to lug through the mountain passes without smashing them to splinters. You wind back the catapults and you're all ready. The enemy's about to charge, so you give the order, break out the snakes. So they open up the jars and find that all the snakes have died in the night just to spite you. He sighed. I won't tell you what he said about the military uses of honey. It's one of those things that gets inside your head and lies dormant for a while, and then you go mad. Miel shrugged. Why are you wasting your time with this stuff? He said. Desperation, I think, Orsi replied. I asked the librarian to look out anything he could find that looked like a military manual or textbook. So far, that was the pick of the bunch. Miel frowned. The spy business, he said. You're worried they're planning to invade. Yes, Orsi said. It's the only explanation that makes any sense. Say what you like about the Republic, they don't waste money. If they're spying on us, it must mean they're planning an attack, and when it comes, we don't stand a chance. Miel shifted slightly. There are other explanations, he said. We've been through all this. Orsi slid his face between his hands. There ought to be something we could do, he said. I know this sounds really stupid, but I've got this horrible picture in my mind. One of those fancy illuminated histories where you get charts of kings and queens. And there's one that says, the Dukes of Aremia, and there's all the names with dates and who they married, and right at the bottom there's me. Orsi Orsiolis, and nothing to follow. I hate the thought that it's all going to end with me, and all because... Pull yourself together, for God's sake, Miel said. He hadn't meant to say it so loud. Orsi looked up at him. I'm sorry, he said. Don't worry about it, Orsi said warily. Maybe you're right. Maybe we can still get out of this in one piece. But if we don't, whose fault will it be? I can't seem to get past that, somehow. Miel took a deep breath and let it go slowly. Think about it, will you? He said. Like you said yourself, the Mezzanines don't waste money. We aren't a threat to them, not now. It'd take a fortune in money and God knows how many lives to take the city. They aren't going to do it. What would it achieve for them, apart from wiping out thousands of customers for all that useless junk they churn out? But Orsi shook his head. This isn't what we were going to talk about, he said. No, it isn't. Miel tried to recall what the meeting was supposed to deal with. Ambassadors from the Cure Hardy, he remembered, arriving sometime next week. Yes, Orsi replied. Well, they're early. Turned up this morning. Suddenly appeared out of nowhere, according to Serba. Who? Slight frown. Serba Focus, the warden of the southern zone, your second cousin. Miel shrugged. Practically everybody above the rank of captain was his second cousin. Right, he said. Sorry, you were singing. Hang on, though. In fact, Orsi continued, one of his patrols took them for bandits and arrested them, which is a great way to start a diplomatic relationship. Don't laugh, Miel ordered himself. Well, at least it shows our border security's up to scratch, he said. But what were they doing on Serba's patch? I thought they'd be coming up the Lona Zepp road. Don't ask me, Orsi said, standing up. I suppose they must have wandered off the road and got lost. I don't think it'd be tactful to ask them. Anyway, I've rescheduled the meeting for just after early vespers. We can go straight into dinner as soon as it's over. God knows what we're going to give them to eat. They discussed the agenda for the meeting for a while. Miel did his best without being too obvious about it, but Orsi refused to cheer up. A pity. Establishing proper grown-up diplomatic relations with the Cure Hardy was easily the biggest success of Orsi's reign so far, and he'd mostly brought it about by his own efforts, choosing and sending presents, writing letters, refusing to be put off by the lack of a reply or even the disappearance of his messengers. Also, Miel couldn't help thinking, though he'd made himself promise not to entertain such thoughts. If the Republic actually was considering an invasion of Aremia, a rapprochement with their barbarous southern neighbors couldn't come at a better time. Given the Mezzantine's paranoia about the Cure Hardy, it wouldn't take much in the way of dark hints and artful suggestion to persuade them that Orsi had concluded an offensive and defensive alliance with the savages, and that war with Aremia would open the door to limitless hordes of Cure Hardy tribesmen poised to flood down out of the mountains like volcanic lava. That alone might be enough to avert an invasion, provided that the Mezzantines didn't think too long or hard about how such hordes might be expected to cross the uncrossable desert. As soon as he could get away without being rude, Miel left the long solar and crossed the quadrangle to the east apartments. At least, he thought, the Cure Hardy had taken his mind off the letter for a while. It's all right, Miel whispered to Orsi, as they took their seats in the lesser day chamber, behind a table the size of a castle door. I sent the kitchen steward to the market, and he brought up all the game he could find. Venison, boar, hare, mountain goat, you name it. Also, he's doing roast mutton, guinea fowl, peahen, and rabbit and cider. There's going to be something in that lot they'll eat. Marvelous, Orsi said. And plenty of booze, too, I hope. Miel shuddered slightly. Enough to float a coal barge. Wine, beer, porter, mead, cider. Then we should be all right, Orsi said, with a faint sigh of relief. At least something will go right. Are you nervous? Petrified. Same here. Right, we better have them in and take a look at them. Miel nodded to the chamberlain, who slid noiselessly away, and returned with the fascinating exotic guests. Miel and Orsi stood up. Miel bowed slightly. Orsi nodded. There were 5 of them. Miel's first impression was simply surprise. He'd been expecting, savages in animal skins with rings through their eyebrows? Something like that. Instead, he saw 5 old men in identical plain brown robes, loose at the neck and full in the sleeve, some kind of coarse wool. They had sandals on their feet and rather splendid silk sashes around their waists. Their faces reminded him irresistibly of hawks, on the bow perch in the mews, the same bright round eyes, the stillness of the head, the set expression. All 5 of their faces were tanned and deeply lined. They all wore short white beards, and their hair was cropped close. One of them was bald with a slightly pointed head. They bowed, too. If pressed, Miel would have said they were trying to copy their host's manner of greeting. Translator, he thought. We need a translator. How the hell are we going to understand each other? While he was cursing himself for overlooking this vital point, the bald man cleared his throat with a soft cough and said, "Thank you for agreeing to see us." His pronunciation was excellent, received Mezzantine. His voice deep, his accent noticeable but not in the least intrusive. He had a little stub of a nose and a small, almost translucent ears. "We apologize," he went on, "for arriving early. We had already embarked on our journey when our guide pointed out to us a more direct road, which we followed. We hope we have not inconvenienced you." "Not at all." Orsi was sounding nervously cheerful. At least Meal could construe nerves in the tone of voice. He'd known Orsi too long to be able to judge whether anybody else would have picked up on it. The savages didn't seem at all apprehensive, as though they did the sort of thing every day before breakfast. "We're delighted to meet you, and thank you for coming. My name is Orsi Orsiolis, and this is my advisor, Meal Ducas." The bald man dipped his head and recited his name and the names of his colleagues. They slipped through Meal's mind like eels, but he'd never been good with names. He fancied the bald man was called something like Carla Region. He didn't have a clue what it'd look like written down. Orsi bowed again. They bowed back. Orsi tried some vague gestures to get them to sit down, which eventually they did. Something about the chairs bothered them, but they didn't say anything. "Perhaps," the bald man said, "we should get down to business. You would like to establish a formal diplomatic mission to the Biavots." Meal blinked. Surely they hadn't gotten the wrong savages after all. Or was Biawotsit the name of their capital city? Except nomads don't have cities. In that case, what was the whatever he'd just said? Some name they called their leader? Orsi said, "Yes, absolutely." Meal knew he was confused too and trying hard not to show it. Was one of the savages smiling? "We would, of course, be happy to forge this historic link," the bald man went on. "However, there are various issues that we should perhaps address at this stage, matters you may not be aware of which may influence your decision. If you have already considered these points, please forgive us." He paused. Really, Meal thought, they're far more polite than I expected. "Please go on," Orsi said. The bald man nodded, then looked at the man on his left, who said, "We must confess, we are a little puzzled why you should have chosen us, rather than, say, the Flosklaya or the Lausita. Not that we do not appreciate the honor of being the first of the Kure Hardy to open a dialogue with your people, but our circuit brings us to the edge of the desert only once every 20 years, and in the interim we spend most of our time in the Colombe and the Rosenhalet valleys, by our calculations some 800 miles from the nearest point on your border. With the best will in the world, communications between us and yourselves would be difficult. We should point out that the sects through whose circuits your envoys would need to pass are nearly all hostile to us, and accordingly we would not be able to guarantee their safety outside our own circuit. Furthermore," the man went on, frowning slightly, "although naturally we have only a sketchy and incomplete knowledge of your economic position, we have to ask whether any regular trade between yourselves and us would be worth the effort. The cost of transporting bulk foodstuffs, for example, would be prohibitive. Likewise, heavy goods such as metal ores or timber. As for luxury goods..." Sects, Meal thought. He must mean tribes, something like that. "We thought the Kure Hardy were all one tribe, but maybe there's loads of them all different, and we've picked the wrong one." "Your points are well made," Orsi was saying. The savage had stopped talking. There had been a brief, brittle silence. "However, I must confess we hadn't really thought as far ahead as trade and so on. Really, all we're trying to do at this stage is, well, get to know each other. One step at a time is what I'm getting at." "Of course," the savage nodded very slightly. "Forgive us if we were unduly forward. Naturally, we welcome any overtures of friendship, and of course our two nations have much to offer each other, above and beyond mere material commerce. In any event, we have clarified the position as far as we are concerned." As the afternoon wore on, Meal found it increasingly hard to concentrate. Reading between the lines, he was fairly certain that his earlier guess had been right. There were any number of different tribes of Kure Hardy, and they'd somehow managed to get in touch with the wrong one. That was annoying, to say the least, but the thing needn't be a complete disaster. If they were tactful and managed not to give too much away, they ought at the very least to be able to get some useful background information, enough to help them figure out which tribe they really wanted to talk to. From what he'd managed to glean so far, Meal thought either the Lausita or the Aram Chantat, though, confusingly, the Lausita were apparently the mortal enemies of the Biavots. The Aram Chantat hated the Lausita like poison, not as far as he could make out vice versa, though, and both the Biavots and the Aram Chantat were best friends with the Rosenhalet, who hated everybody else in the whole world. It might, Meal decided, be a good idea to find out a whole lot more before venturing any serious diplomatic initiatives. At least the invitation to dinner went down well. At the mention of food, the savages became quite animated, and one of them even smiled. A good feed and a few drinks might liven them up a bit, Meal thought, loosen their tongues and get them to relax a little. So far they'd been so stiff and formal that he wondered if they really were savages at all. "May we venture to ask," one of them was saying as they made their way to the great hall. "How matters stand between yourselves and the Republic of Mezentia? Our own relations with the Mezentines have been few and perfunctory, but cordial nonetheless." Meal didn't manage to hear Orsi's reply to that, because at that moment the bald man asked him something about Aremian horse breeding. Apparently, the horses he'd seen since he crossed the border were quite like the ones back home, which were different from the horses raised by most of the other sects. Meal answered as best he could, but he didn't know the technical stuff the bald man seemed to be after. He tried to remember if his cousin Jarnak had been invited to the dinner. He'd know all about it if he was here. Meanwhile, the bald man was telling him a lot of stuff he didn't really want to know about horse breeding back home. He let his attention wander as they crossed the front courtyard until the bald man said, "Of course we are only a small sect. We muster barely 900,000 men-at-arms, and so our pool of broodmares is far smaller than that of the larger sects such as the Lausida or the Dochevots." "Excuse me," Meal said. "Did you say 900,000? The bald man nodded. "It is our small size that enables us to follow such a wide circuit. The larger sects are confined to more circumscribed areas since they need to graze 8, even 10 times that number. We can subsist, therefore, where they cannot, and they are not tempted to appropriate our grazing, since it would be of no use to them. Accordingly—" "This is the great hall," Orsi interrupted. "If you'd like to follow me." There was something vaguely comic about the savages' reactions to being inside it. From time to time, when they thought no one was looking, they'd crane their necks and snatch a quick look at the roof beams, as though they were worried it was all about to come crashing down on their heads. Fair enough, Neil reckoned, if they lived their entire lives in tents. If anything else about their surroundings impressed them, they gave no sign of it, and that made Meal wonder if their ingenuous remarks about their few but cordial contacts with the Republic were the truth, and the whole truth. They'd be forgiven for regarding the great hall of the castle as no big deal if they were familiar with the interior of the guild hall. Before Meal took his place at the table, he made a show of beckoning to the hall steward. When the man came over to him, he leaned in close and whispered, "Get me something to write on." Luckily, the steward knew him well enough not to argue. He disappeared and came back a moment later with a dripping pen and a scrap of parchment, hastily cut from the wrapping of a lowland cheese. Resting against the wall, Meal scribbled, "Orsi, there are millions of them. Give this to the Duke when the guests aren't looking," he muttered to the steward. Then he sat next to the bald man. "This is a most impressive building," the bald man said, without much sincerity. "Are the crosspieces of the roof each made from a single tree, or are they spliced together in some way?" Meal had no idea, but he said, "A single tree. They were brought in specially from the north," because he reckoned that was what the man would want to hear. Maybe it was. He didn't pursue the subject further. Instead, he asked what sort of timber the table was made of. Meal didn't know that either, so he said it was oak, at which point the server started bringing in the food. "We have a serious shortage of timber," the bald man said. "Traditionally, we cut lumber from the forests of the Kulom Valley in the 7th year of our circuit. Recently, however, the Dochevots have laid claim to that part of the valley and forbidden us to fell any standing timber. This leaves us in an unfortunate position, dogwood, hazel, and ash in particular." Meal nodded politely while scanning the incoming dishes. The steward had done a good job at short notice. As well as the venison, boar, hare, mountain goat, roast mutton, guinea fowl, peahen, and rabbit and cider, there was partridge, rock grouse, just coming into season, collar dove, and whole roast goose. He nodded to the steward, who nodded to the servers. "Excuse me," said the bald man. He looked embarrassed. So did his colleagues. "Excuse me," he repeated, "but we do not eat meat." "But," Orsi said, then he checked himself and went on. "What can we get for you?" "Some cheese, perhaps?" The bald man stressed the word as if he wasn't sure his hosts had ever heard of it. "And some plain bread and fruit, if possible." "Of course." Credit where it was due, Orsi was taking it in his stride. "What would you like to drink? We've got wine, beer—" just a trace of a frown. "We do not drink intoxicants," the bald man said. "Plain water would suit us very well." "Plain water," Orsi repeated. "Fine. Take all this away." He waved to the steward and said, "Take all this away, fetch us some bread and cheese, apples, and some jugs of water." "Certainly, sir," the steward said, and handed him the scrap of parchment. Meal wasn't sure, because the bald man partly obstructed his view, but he had an idea that Orsi flinched when he read it. He dropped it beside his plate. Sometime later, Meal noticed, while Orsi was talking to the man on his other side, the savage quietly picked it up, glanced at it, and tucked it into his sleeve. The dinner didn't last long, since there wasn't much to eat, and the visitors didn't care for music or dancing either. Orsi himself took them to their quarters, allowing Meal to escape from the great hall and beat a hasty retreat to the security of his office, the main attraction of which was a tall stone bottle of the distilled liquor the Vidani made from mountain oats. It went by the curious name of Living Death, and Meal reckoned it would probably be the only thing in the world that might do him some good. He'd swallowed 3 fingers of the stuff, and was nerving himself for another dose, when Orsi came in without knocking. He crossed to the empty chair, dropped into it like a headshot doe, and groaned. "Come in," Meal said. "Take a seat." "Thanks," Orsi replied. "Meal, have you still got any of that disgusting Vidani stuff that tastes like etching acid?" Meal pushed the small horn cup across the table. He was a loyal subject and could drink straight from the bottle when he had to. "I'm fairly sure," Orsi said slowly, after he'd taken his medicine, "that there wasn't anything else we could have got wrong. I mean, as far as I can see, we've got the complete set. If I missed anything, though, we could have a stab at it tomorrow morning early before they set off." Meal thought for a moment. "We didn't actually kill any of them," he said, "or set fire to their hair." "True." Orsi leaned forward and reached for the bottle. "But that'd just be gilding the lily. We did enough, I reckon." It didn't go well. "Not really." Orsi passed the bottle back, and they sat in silence for a while. "What bugs me, though," Meal said, "is why they came up from the south instead of down the Lona Zep road." He had a certain amount of trouble with the word Lona Zep. "It's all very well saying they got lost, but they were early. If they'd got lost, they should have been late." "Wish they had got lost," Orsi said, "permanently." Another silence. Then Meal said, "Well, now we know what the Curé Hardy looked like." "Miserable lot," Orsi said, "always complaining. Didn't like their rooms much either. Oh, they didn't say anything, but I could tell." Meal suggested various things they could do. "And besides," he went on, "it doesn't actually matter, does it? You heard them. Wouldn't be back this way for another 20 years, by which time," he added brightly, "we'll all have been massacred by the Mezentines." "There's that," Orsi conceded. "No, I won't, thanks," as Meal threatened him with the bottle. "Gotta be up early tomorrow to see him off, don't forget, and I'd hate for us to have a bad impression." One thing, Meal remembered. That bald man. He asked me if we could sell them some wood. Orsi frowned as if the concept was unfamiliar to them. Wood. "That's right, for immediate delivery before they move out of range. Dogwood, Cornell wood, ash, hazel. Willing to pay top thaler for quality merchandise." "Well, he's out of luck," Orsi said. "Besides, after the way they behaved, I wouldn't sell them wood if they were the last men on earth. Screw them, in fact." "Absolutely." Meal thought for a bit, but all the edges were getting blurred. "What's dogwood?" he asked. "No idea." "Doesn't matter." Meal waved away dogwood in perpetuity. "Surely you won't have another?" Revolting stuff. "Just a taste, then." Just a taste was all that was left in the bottle. Odd, Meal thought, because it was nearly full a moment ago. Evaporation, maybe? "I'll save this for them. Say this for them," he said. "If I hadn't known they were savages, I'd never have guessed." Orsi concentrated. "Insidious," he said. "Get under your guard, pretending to be not savage." He looked at the tips of his fingers for a long minute, then said, "So let's get this straight. Nearest to our border are the Doce Votes. Next to them are the Rosenhalet." Meal shook his head. "An interesting experience." "No, you've got it wrong," he said. "Next to the Doce Votes you've got the Lausita. Next to them there's the Aram Chantat." "The Aram Chantat, you sure?" Meal shrugged. "Something like that. Anyhow, now we know what they're like, these barbarians. No meat and no drink." "Exactly. Now that we know what they're like, we can talk to them. Bloody useful initiative. Good men to have on your side in a fight, I bet." For some reason, Orsi thought this was terribly funny. So after a moment did Meal. "No, but seriously," Meal went on. "If only we knew why they didn't come up the Lona Zep road." "Yeah, that too. Can't figure that out. Bloody great big desert in the way if you're coming from that direction. Should have starved and parched 10 times over before they got here." "Oh, I don't know," Orsi objected. "I mean, they don't eat a lot, or drink." He reached for the bottle just in case there was a drop lurking inside it somewhere, and knocked it off the table onto the floor. "Bloody Vidani," he said. "Can't even make a bottle that stands upright." Not long after he fell asleep. Meal, who knew about protocol, struggled to his feet, called a page, and had Orsi carried back to his apartments. Then he flopped back into his chair and closed his eyes. That was one of the good things about not being a duke. He could grab 40 winks in his chair without having to be carried home like a drunk. Someone he didn't know woke him up in his chair the next morning with a message from Orsi. The Curé Hardy had gone home, the message said. Meal asked the stranger what time it was. Just after noon, the man replied. The Duke's compliments, and it would have been nice if Meal could have been there to see them on their way. A little later, he found Orsi in the small rose garden and apologized. His head hurt, and his digestion wasn't quite right. That what came of eating bread and cheese for dinner, Orsi said, which probably explained why he forgot to tell Orsi about the letter. He considered mentioning it then and there, but decided not to. Since he wasn't feeling his best, he reckoned he might as well go home. On his way, he ran into Sarit Caliphates, who thanked him for inviting him to meet the Curie Hardy at dinner. It was news to Meal that he'd done so, but he accepted the thanks in the spirit in which they were given. So, Meal said, I haven't seen you around much lately. Been busy? Caliphates nodded. In my new business venture, he said, with a slight roll of the eyes. I'm starting to wonder what I've got myself into. Remind me? Meal said. The mezzanine, Caliphates said. You suggested it, remember? Oh, yes, Meal said. Him. Going well? You could say that, Caliphates muttered. Going to cost me an absolute fortune by the time he's done. Still, clever man, can't deny that. This morning he was on about some new way of smelting iron ore. Reckons it'd be better than how it's done in Mezenti even. Anyway, that's what I need to talk to you about sometime. Not now, he added, because he was a reasonably perceptive man. Later, when you've got a moment, I'll send my clerk and he can fix up a time. Splendid, Meal said. I'll look forward to that. So what did you think of the savages? Not what I'd been expecting, Caliphates admitted. Quiet. Can't say I took to them. Well, they've gone now, Meal said. Still, we had some useful discussions. Caliphates nodded. Wonder what they'll make of the merchant adventurers, he said. Don't suppose they've got anything like them back where they come from. The merchant adventurers? What have they got to do with anything? Well, the men I was talking to last night said they were meeting them this morning on their way home. Didn't they mention it? Possibly, Meal said. Can't think why, though. They live too far away. He shrugged. He had had enough of the Curie Hardy. Can't do any harm, he said. Probably want to sell them something, Caliphates said, reasonably enough. In which case, bloody good luck. Strange people, though, all those different tribes. Sects, Meal corrected. Yeah, as you say, sects. The men I was talking to did try and explain, but I'm afraid I lost the thread. Apparently they're all descended from one tribe, but they split up hundreds of years ago over religious differences. They've stopped believing in that religion long since, but they keep up with the differences. Charming, though, about the names. What about the names? Meal asked. Well, the names of the sects, let's see. Caliphates' narrow forehead crinkled in thought. Their lot, the Biavots. That means beautiful voice in their language. The Rosenhalet are the nightingales. The Aram Chantat are the voices raised in song. The Flosklaya are the meadow flowers or something of the sort, and so on. Apparently they believe that when they die, they're reborn as songbirds. Good heavens, Meal said, mildly stunned. Caliphates nodded. People are curious, aren't they? Well, I won't keep you. He dipped his head in formal salutation and scuttled away. The beautiful voice and the meadow flowers. Meal gave that a great deal of thought on the way home, but in spite of his best endeavors, he was unable to arrive at any meaningful conclusion.